The broadcast is now.
Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. I just want to do a sound check before we go any further. Could I just get people in the various locations, if you could just type in clear on the question box, that just lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. That would be great. Thank you. Excellent, thanks Sam. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, let's get underway. I'm assuming that I'm coming across loud and clear. Welcome everybody to this webinar. Look forward to working with you over the next, say, 45 minutes and see how we go. All good. Thanks, Tony. That's great. Great to hear that everything's going well in the training room. Coming across loud and clear. Obviously, you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this. And if you've got any questions as we go through the process, the normal process is just to go to that question box where you typed in the word clear and just type in your questions and I'll respond to them the moment I get them. So it won't be that I'll wait till the end for the last 5 minutes. I'll actually respond as soon as I see them. So that's the way we'll do things. So it's an interesting topic today, which is about getting the best from other people and motivating people. And so I want to cover a fair bit of territory this morning because it's an important topic for you as a manager, because obviously one of the key responsibilities in your role is actually about getting the best from the people that you lead. So I hope your check-ins are going well. I hope you're having lots of really good conversations with your people. And I hope you're using some of the tools, of course, that we've been going through in the Check-in at Treasury program. Okay, so let's get underway. There's three things that I wanted to really cover today. I wanted to talk a little bit about just talking about expectations, and I want to talk a little bit around what motivates people and what some of the key drivers are around motivation. So we asked you to start giving feedback, and we were hoping that you'd do that. And it's important to do that because we're trying to create a culture around giving constructive feedback. So it's important to do that. So if you're not sure where to start, the obvious place to start is to give some positive feedback. And if you're giving positive feedback, it's a little safer and nonetheless effective though, and often perhaps even more effective. So looking for some positive things and giving that feedback either during the check-ins or of course, you don't have to wait for the check-ins. You can do that at any particular time. All right, so we wanted to talk about some of the myths around motivation. We wanted to talk about what people want out of their job. And I wanted to talk about the concept of non-job tasks, which I think is very relevant to anyone in any role. And finally, just talk about some of the models of motivation that are out there and, more importantly, how they apply to you and the work that you do. Okay, so I would argue, as I said at the outset, that your primary role as a leader is to get the very best from the people that you lead. Now, so if you could rate people on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of their level of output, and let's say you rated someone a 6 out of 10, you may not get them to a 10 out of 10, but it's certainly possible to get them to a 7 out of 10. Or someone that might be rated at a 7 out of 10, it's possible to get them to an 8 out of 10. So this is the mindset that you need to have. It's all about getting that little extra discretionary effort from the people that you lead. And while it mightn't sound terribly impressive when you're talking about moving from a 6 to a 7 in motivation, if you did that across the board with your team, it can make a significant difference exponentially in terms of output. So the whole key is, how do I get that little extra? And I'm hoping today that I'll be able to answer some of those questions and perhaps fill in some of the gaps that might be there in terms of your knowledge about this topic. So the first thing I wanted to do really is let's just unpack this definition of motivation, because I think motivation means different things to different people. And while this is a very busy slide, I think it encapsulates what motivation's all about. So motivation is the forces within an individual that accounts for the level, direction and persistence of effort expended at work. The key words there are within. So motivation is an inside job, basically meaning, of course, that it's really up to the individual to make the decision about whether they become motivated. Now, that's a fairly important and subtle distinction, because I think many of us in our leadership role do what we can to try to motivate people, and so we should be creating that motivational environment. But at the end of the day, it's the individual that makes that choice and that decision. Now, the other thing about that definition is there's 3 dimensions to motivation. So when you look at somebody and make a generalization and say that person's motivated or that person's not motivated, what are you actually referring to? So let's have a look at those 3 dimensions. The reason I'm sharing these dimensions with you is that when you're actually working with other people, you can kind of be a little bit more nuanced in terms of what it is that they're motivated, or what motivation are they showing or not showing. So one of the dimensions is the direction. And by direction, what we mean by that is that the person's choice about, when presented with a number of alternatives, what direction do they take? So this is all about priorities. In other words, are people working on the right things at the right time, in the right way, with the right people? So one dimension of motivation is the focus of the individual or the direction. So obviously we've all, worked with people who are working on things that perhaps needn't be worked on at the time, or we're quite puzzled about where their direction's at. So definitely that is a part of it, but it's not all of it. The second dimension about that is, of course, the persistence that the person puts into the role or the job. So what that basically means is how long a person sticks to a given course of action. And that is not giving up too early and taking a reasonable and putting a reasonable amount of persistence in and making sure that they see it through to the end. That's probably a more traditional definition of motivation, but again, it's only one of the dimensions. And the third dimension is the level of intensity that someone puts in to the effort. So, somebody could be working on the right thing, they could be putting some persistence in, but their intensity isn't where it needs to be, which of course is going to affect their level of motivation, or at least getting the job done. So it's about direction, it's about persistence, and it's about the level of intensity. So I think if you've got to have a conversation with people in relation to their level of motivation, whether it's positive or not, I think you can talk more in terms of the 3 dimensions rather than the broad statement about the person not being motivated, or if it's a positive thing, being motivated. What is it about their behaviour specifically? Is it the direction? Is it the persistence? Or is it the level of intensity? So I guess we just wanted to get that clear before we moved on any further to talk about, getting the best out of the people that you lead. Okay, now I want to share with you some myths and some misunderstandings, I think, around the whole concept of motivation. And I think there is a lot of misleading information out there about motivation. I think it's important that we unpack all of that before we move on. So let's look at some of these myths. Now, one of the myths about motivation is that you and I can't actually motivate anybody. All right, and this is an important distinction. All we can do is we can create the circumstances or the environment whereby people may choose to be motivated. So in other words, it's their choice. Now, this was important to me when I was in the corporate world, because I actually was operating under the myth that I could motivate people. And I'd often get disheartened when I'd find that people just weren't motivated in one of those 3 dimensions that I talked about. And then I realized, of course, that really all I can do is create the right environment. Ultimately, it is up to the individual to make the decision. And I mean, a very simple example of that, of course, is that, you could be sitting there next to somebody during this webinar, and you could walk out of this webinar thinking that was wonderful, got a lot out of it. The person sitting next to you, albeit even with the same information, might have a completely different perspective on it. So it's the internalisation of the experience that's critically important. I think that, so all we can do is create the right environment, and it's up to the individual. The other myth about motivation, and we do make generalisations about this, is that everybody actually is motivated to some degree. And I think sometimes we make sweeping statements like that person's a very motivated person or that person's not. It's not really a good generalisation to make, because just getting out of bed this morning is a motivation. It could be the fear of letting the team down on the one hand, or it could actually be bouncing out of bed wanting to take on an opportunity or a project that I'm working on. So we're all to a certain degree motivated, but the reality is that we're not always inspired. And of course, as you know, our motivation ebbs and flows depending on what we're dealing with at the time and so forth, what experiences we're having. So it's really important to recognise that everybody has a degree of motivation. It's just that not everyone is inspired about everything that they do. So you can make that distinction. It's not so much a myth, but another concept I'd like to touch on is the idea that motivation is very subjective. So the reality is what motivates you is probably not the same thing that motivates your team members. And the big danger that a lot of managers make is that they make the assumption without thinking about it that what motivates them actually motivates everybody else. And that's a big mistake. For example, when I was in the corporate world, I enjoy challenges. One of my key things in life is I love to take on new challenges. I dare say some of you are the same. And of course, I assumed that the people that I was leading actually wanted to be challenged. Now, some did and some didn't. So in other words, I was quite disappointed with those that didn't, and I couldn't understand why they didn't want to step up to the plate. Obviously, they had other types, their motivation in their mind was a completely different concept. So I think, it's important to just recognise that. And of course, we've heard a lot about generations in the workplace. Different generations in the workplace have different motivations and different drivers. Now, these motivations, of course, will change throughout our lives. So what motivated you, say, 10 years ago may not be motivating you now. So these things ebb and flow and change. And I guess what's important is just to recognise what motivates people, watch and listen and learn, and of course the check-ins are the perfect opportunity to look at those sorts of things. So it is very subjective, and it's important to recognise that. Now, as I said earlier, motivation is an inside job. So in other words, intrinsic motivation is more powerful than extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic meaning internal, extrinsic meaning external. So in other words, a lot of us in our workplace use what we might refer to as the carrot and the stick. So reward and punishment, basically, which of course are extrinsic motivational forces. They do have some degree of impact, but the reality is intrinsic motivation is, by its nature, the most powerful form of motivation. And when I talk to recruiters about the choice between, recruiting somebody on the basis of a skill set versus a intrinsic motivation, they'll often say that an intrinsic motivation is far more powerful and effective than a skill set, because the argument is, of course, if people are internally driven, it's often possible for them to learn the skills that they need to learn in the workplace. So it's intrinsic motivation that's what is the real driver here, rather than the carrot and the stick or the external motivation we talk about. Now, one of the key things that I think often is misunderstood is that money is overestimated as a motivational force. Now, I'm not saying it's not important, and don't get me wrong, and I guess if the government stopped paying Treasury employees tomorrow, I would assume, of course, that motivation would decrease significantly, not to mention many other things. But the key word in that statement is overestimated. So what this says, and research has demonstrated this, Hertzberg's research demonstrates that to a certain degree, money is important, to a certain degree. But beyond that threshold, whatever that might be, it no longer becomes the motivational force. And what that means in plain English is that if it was possible to double everybody's salary, so, we just doubled it overnight, would that mean that we'd double the level of discretionary effort? Possibly, for a short period of time, that may well be the case, but it certainly wouldn't be, it wouldn't be something that was sustainable. So the point is that it is often overestimated, and people want lots of things in their work besides, of course, the income to be able to pay for a quality of life. So I just think it's important to think about those things, and I've got a couple of examples of that I'll run through. I'll give you an example now. In Queensland, for example, when the mining boom took off, there were lots of people in local government who decided to move from local government into the mining industry. They had the skill set, and they did that on the basis that their salary would double overnight. And so, yes, people did take advantage of that, and they were motivated by that. But I also spoke to a lot of people that decided not to take that opportunity, who perhaps could have taken it. And the reason for that is that they felt that, they had a 9-day fortnight and they had all their friends at work. They enjoyed the work they were doing for the community in local government, and that was the driver for them. So we've got to be careful not to think about money being the overriding consideration in all motivation. It's not. Now, the final principle there I want to talk about is that people are essentially, when we boil it all down, people are motivated by the pain-pleasure principle. What that simply means is that people will avoid pain and seek pleasure. So everything that people do in life, every single thing, everything people think, everything people do, is motivated by an avoidance of pain and seeking pleasure. Now that sounds very simplistic, but it is true if you think about it. But here's where it gets very complex. Every one of us conceptualizes pain and pleasure in different ways. So what might be painful for me may not be for you. What might be pleasurable for me may not be pleasurable for you. So a typical example is two people are in their cars at a traffic light side by side, but they're both late to a meeting, and one person is stressing and cursing and swearing in the car. The other person is just chilling out, listening to some music, knowing full well that there's nothing that they can do about the circumstances they're in until the light goes green. So the same circumstances occurring to two people, one's conceptualizing it as extremely painful and the other one is not. So I think I think you would understand what I meant about that. So the pain pleasure principle is very, very relevant in the work that we do. Now, you may have had an opportunity to go through a little survey that would have been provided for you to look at the 10 qualities that people want in their job. And this can be quite revealing. Now, this was put together. There were something in the order of 9,000 people who were basically involved in this research. And they simply asked people a very simple question. They just said, if there was one thing that was critically important for you in any job, not just the job you've got, but any job, what would it be? And people had to write that down. Now, in those 9,000 employees, we had public sector, private sector, not-for-profit. So it was right across the board. It covered 3 particular continents. So it was a fairly significant survey. Now, so what came up in that was very interesting, because number 1 on the list, and I wonder if you can guess what number 1 was if you haven't seen the research. Number 1 on the list was this. People said that ultimately what they wanted in their work, any job, not just the job they've got, but any job, was they wanted to work for efficient managers. And I think that's quite interesting. So if that, in fact, and of course this was a frequency survey, so this number 1 thing was the thing that was the most recognised of all the things that people were mentioning in the survey. So obviously this has got implications for you and me, because clearly if people think that they want to work for efficient managers, then you have an opportunity to be able to fulfil that for people. So they want managers who are clear about the direction they want, They want managers who recognise good performance. They want managers who delegate appropriately. They don't want managers that micromanage. They want all of these things and if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because most people, of course, spend a lot of time working with their manager, and the manager can make or break somebody's level of enjoyment in the workplace. In fact, a lot of exit interviews, which are those interviews that are done right at the end when people leave and they're asked, why are you leaving? And then the truth comes out. Often the number one consideration is a poor relationship with their manager. And so what the check-ins, of course, are trying to do is to build capacity in that regard. So it is quite critical. And of course, the old adage is that people don't leave organisations, they leave managers. So it is a pretty important driving force for most people, obviously. And remember, this isn't my work, this is the work from the research. Another thing is, or the second thing that was on the list, is that people want to think for themselves, which is fair and reasonable. People want autonomy, particularly knowledge workers. And of course, you're working in your industry with knowledge workers. You're a knowledge worker, and so is everybody else who works in your team. And knowledge workers actually want to be able to have a little bit of, or be able to exercise a little bit of autonomy around what they do. So obviously, if you're micromanaging people, that would be the antithesis of this, to think for themselves. So that was number 2 on the list. Number 3 on the list was that people want to see an end result for their work. They want to feel a sense of accomplishment. They want to see that what they do makes a difference. Now, for you in Treasury, that would provide you with some challenges, because if someone's completing a report, they may not think about the implications of that report, where it will go and what difference it could or couldn't make. So it may not necessarily be a motivator for them. Now, I'll give you an example. I was talking about local government earlier. I went into a local government environment in Queensland, and I went out to the outdoor staff, simply asked them a question on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? And I aggregated all of those results and came up with an average of 5.8 out of 10. And then I went to the indoor staff of the same organisation, and I asked the same question on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? And the score that I got back was a 5.2. In other words, the aggregate result in the outdoor staff was higher than the indoor staff, which surprised me somewhat. And I asked some of the people in the outdoor, why is it that what is it that motivates you about the work that you do? And several of them said, it's because we can see the road that we've built. We can see the pothole we've filled in. We can see the bridge we've built. We can see the parks and gardens that we've tidied up. In other words, there was a line of sight between what they did and the end result. So the key point for you here is that you need to explain very clearly the implications of the work that people do and its impact on other parts of the organisation and beyond, and the government and community and everything else. And don't assume, of course, that people have actually connected the dots between their work and the end result. Number 4 on the list is people want to be, assigned interesting work. And now, not all work, of course, is interesting. And that's the reality of it. A lot of work we do is drudgery. That's the reality of it. It doesn't matter whether you're a senior manager or, somebody that's just starting out. There is a bulk of work that's probably not all that interesting. So what we've got to try and do, of course, is give people a little bit of variety and an opportunity to chance their arm and exercise their interests in the workplace. And I guess that's the implication of number 4. The 9,000 employees said that number 4 on the list was that they want to be kept informed. There was 2 types of information they wanted. They wanted to know how they're going in their job, right? So that's feedback. And, here again, feedback's critically important. They also wanted to know what's happening with the organisation, where it was going in the future, what developments it was making, and so forth and so on. So again, you can do a lot about that. You can explain to people in your team meetings what's going on, where Treasury is heading, what some of the challenges are up ahead and all the rest of it. And of course, individually, you can give people feedback on how they're performing as well. Number 6 on the list, people said in the survey that they wanted to be listened to, which is fair enough. And I think, again, many of us can assume that that we're all listening to people. But I mean, one of the reasons that these check-ins will be so important and work well is only if you give 100% undivided attention to that individual during that check-in. That is extremely important. Really listening to people is hard work. And I'm sure you'd be aware of that. It's not something that's easy to do. We make assumptions about what people think and all the rest of it. So that's number 6 on the list. Number 7 on the list is that people felt that people wanted to be respected in a job. And respect means that their opinion's valued, that they're given an opportunity to have a say. They may not exercise that opportunity, but they want to be given the opportunity. So I think that's very important, and you can draw a line there and say, well, I don't necessarily like the person, but I can still respect them basically as a team member, and that becomes very important. Number 8 on the list is to be recognised for their efforts. So people do want recognition, they do want acknowledgement, they do want thanks, they do need that. And I think that, many of you who are in this webinar are probably self-starters. You've got to the position that you have through your discipline and hard work and good technical skills, and that's great, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But just remember that just because you've got to that position without needing a whole lot of recognition or acknowledgement doesn't necessarily mean that the people that you lead feel the same way. So yes, it is extremely important for you to say thank you, to acknowledge people, to give them an opportunity to be recognised. And we have talked about this in the Lunch and Learn so far. Number 9 on the list is that people want to feel a sense of challenge. Now, again, as I said earlier, not everyone does. But, the reality was it was number 9 on the list. And, there were hundreds of things that came up, but the 9th most important thing was to be challenged. So obviously, many people do want to be challenged, and they do want to feel that they're making a difference. So, you can challenge some people, and I'm sure you're aware of that, and I think you'd probably know who those people may be. And number 10 on the list is that people want an opportunity to increase their skill development. I guess that's what we're doing through the check-ins. I think so it's really important to give people a sense of helping them enhance their skills. And it's not necessarily about sending people off to training courses either. Often it's about just explaining things to people, to coach people, to buddy people up with people that can do the job well. So skill development goes well beyond just sending people off to formal training. So there's the 10 things, and I share that with you because if that's what 9,000 people have said, ultimately what that means is that if you're doing as much of that as you possibly can in your team, notwithstanding some of the constraints you might have, but if you can do those 10 things, then what you're doing is you're creating the motivational environment for people to make the choice about whether or not they, in fact, are motivated. So there you go. So if you've got any questions or comments about any of those 10, just go to the question box and send your question to me, and I'll certainly respond to that. Now, one of the questions that I have for you is this question. If you have one person who's just not motivated, that's your perception of them. Remember, everybody to a certain extent is motivated, but that's your feeling about this person. What do you do? So what do you do if you've got one person that you just can't bring up to a minimum acceptable standard of performance? What do you do? What might be a circuit breaker in this? Well, the answer is this. Ask them. Ask them. Now, and of course, the ideal forum, of course, is the check-in. So what do you ask? Well, try this for size. Try this for a question. Is there anything that I'm doing? This is what you would say. Words to this effect, of course. Is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you be more engaged in your work? Now, you may get nothing back, you may get something back, but it's worth asking the question, isn't it? In other words, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? Because you're often thinking about it, and I think the other person may have something to say about it, and it gives you a chance to open up a dialogue and a conversation with them about that. So, and you'll note that the key thing there is that the other person is less likely to be defensive by you asking this question, because by asking this question, what you're doing is you're basically taking the onus of responsibility yourself. In other words, is there anything that I can readjust or change that might make a difference? And of course, you can then say later, if the conversation does flow, that there are certain things that you require from the other person as well. So, I mean, you're not letting them off the hook, but it's a great way to open up a dialogue with the other person about that. Now, what I want to do now is talk a little bit around the concept of non-job roles. And I think these are critically important, and I wrote a book about this. I felt that so strongly about it, and I think you'll understand why when I share with you this concept of non-job roles. So let's build this model up. So if you think about the work that people do, the work that people do is actually two-dimensional, and it wouldn't matter if it was treasury, a local retail store or anything like that. One dimension of what people do is, of course, their job. That is what's on their job description. This is their technical skills and tasks that they need to do in order to fulfill the requirements of their job description. Now, so that's fairly straightforward. But that's not where it ends. And I think a lot of people think that, as long as, and people actually say it, don't they? They say, well, I'm just following what's on my job description. Well, actually, performance is more than just doing what's on the job description. So that's why I subtitled my book, Shifting from a Job Focus to a Performance Focus. So let's look at the other dimension. The other dimension is what I would refer to as the non-job role. Now, many people over the last 30-odd years have been grappling with the important non-job roles that are generic to all organisations, and they've been dilly-dallying around for a period of time. And I sort of decided to bite the bullet, so to speak, and come up with 4 that I think are critically important in all industries, regardless of what they are, and I think you'd probably agree with me. So what's one non-job role? Now, what I mean by a non-job role is something that's not necessarily highlighted in the job description, but nevertheless is important. Well, one non-job role is a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Now, by that, I'm not suggesting that people should be bouncing off the wall with excitement when they come to work. But by the same token, I'm not expecting people to whinge and whine and complain, pass the buck, all of these sort of things. These are behaviours that all of us, we see pretty much every day. In my view, it's really important that people take a solution focus to their work, to have that positive mindset. And of course, you know what we're talking about there, don't you? And that's the growth mindset that we've covered. It's important that people have a growth mindset about their work. And you might say to me, well, I don't know how to broach that subject with people. Well, what's interesting about that is that I could sit there in your work area for about 20 minutes and observe your people. And you and I could sit down and have a cup of tea at the end of it. And I guarantee we'd both come to the same conclusion about who in your team is exhibiting this non-job role of having a positive attitude. So in other words, there's no mystery. It's fairly obvious who they are and what they're doing and what that means. So don't be afraid to broach these sort of subjects, because if you don't broach them, then there's a couple of issues here. One is that people think that it's quite acceptable to be walking around undermining other people. And why wouldn't they think that? Because no one said anything about it. It's not on my job description. My manager said nothing, so why isn't it okay for me to do that? Now, the other problem with it, of course, is that it drags everybody else down. So you have one person that's being negative and the rest of the team will be dragged down. It's just, you know that. So really, it's almost like you've got an obligation to intervene at that time. And again, use the SBI model: situation, behaviour, impact. What's another non-job role? Well, another non-job role is, I'll just build all that. Whoop, I went too far. Let's come back. So another non-job role is to be a team player. We expect people to operate in a team environment. And again, people will often say, oh, well, I'm not a team player. I just come to work and do my job. But the reality is that most things that are done in Treasury or anywhere else are done with and through other people, are they not? So therefore, being a team player is really non-negotiable. We expect everybody to work and operate and function as part of a team, because they rely on other people for information. Information is conveyed to other people, so you can't really avoid it. So that's a non-job role that's critically important for success in the workplace. The third non-job role is a career role. We expect people to grow and develop in their role. So, but then again, how often have we heard people say, oh, look, I'm used to using this old software. I don't want to upgrade my, adjust to the new software, spreadsheet, whatever it might be. Or people say, I'm too old to go to training, send somebody else. We hear these sorts of things all the time, and it's not really good enough, because obviously, everything's changing and moving in rapid knots, and people aren't actually growing and developing in role, then clearly they're going backwards. But not only that, they're not doing much for their career. So it's not just about, what they're doing in your team, it's they're letting themselves down and in their career as well. And the final thing there is we expect people to bring their brains to work with them and not leave them in a paper bag at the doorway. We want people to come up with ways of making the business and the organisation more efficient and effective. And so we expect people to make suggestions and so forth. But if you don't ask people for suggestions and ideas and entertain what they have to say, then people will think, well, it's just not my role. It's your role. You're the one getting paid as a manager. You're the one that has to come up with all the good ideas, and I just go along and come to work and do my job. So think about it this way. There's 4 non-job roles. Now, let's say your team is highly technically trained. Let's say that their skill set is absolutely superb. So in other words, they're fulfilling what's on the left-hand side on your screen. So in other words, their job role is being done. They've got all that worked out. But what about on the right-hand side? Let's say that your team, everybody is whinging and whining and complaining, so they certainly don't have a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Let's say that everyone on your team is an individual and they're not a team player. They don't look out for each other. Let's say everyone in your team has stopped growing and developing as an individual. And let's say that every one of your team members is not contributing to the efficiency and effectiveness of the workplace. You could obviously see that regardless of how well they're fulfilling their job role, it's likely that productivity will be quite low in your team. So you can see that the things that are on the right-hand side are critically important. And what I'd encourage you to do is to broach those subjects when you are in your check-ins, because they are critical to success. And I hope you can see the value in that. But of course, because they're not on the job description, people often assume that they're not really as important as they perhaps, as we know, they are. All right, so let's talk about some motivational theories and some of the theories that are well known and reputable and what the implications are for you. Now, Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, industrial psychologist, who was around in the 1930s, and he came up with a model which he called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he actually was in a restaurant at the time, and he drew this pyramid up on a napkin, at the time, and he was quite surprised about how it took off in terms of its popularity. But ultimately, his model was very simple. He basically said that human beings are motivated by a hierarchy of needs, and that once that need has been fulfilled, it no longer becomes a need. So at the very basic level, and on your screen there, you can see that survival needs are fundamental. Now, if people don't have air, food and water, then they're not interested in anything else except getting air, food and water. So survival is the number one motivator. Now, fortunately, in our modern society, that has been sorted. So it's not going to be necessarily a motivator, in our work, in the work that you do. The next need is a security need, that is safety. People want to feel that they'll be safe physically, and people want to feel that they're safe psychologically. So therefore, bullying, harassment, health and safety, all of those issues are really about all fulfilling a need. And again, most of our workplaces are devoid of safety issues, fortunately, so therefore it no longer becomes a need. So once that's been met, the next three are very, very important for you in the workplace. The most fundamental level of need for a person in your team is to feel a sense of belonging. What I mean by that is they feel that they are actually part of a team, that they actually have a say, and that their view is important. So when someone new comes into your team, that's their first and foremost motivational force. And if they feel that they're being listened to, then obviously that no longer becomes a motivator. So we've got then prestige. People want to feel that they are important, that they have something to contribute, that they have that their self-esteem is being maintained. And of course, that's more of an individual motivator. So that's you building good working relationships up with your team members, and that's what the check-ins are all about. And then the final need is self-fulfillment, what he called self-fulfillment, which is ultimately around the need to continually grow and develop and stretch in the work I do. Now, I suspect some of you would be at the top of the apex. And if Treasury all of a sudden became a place of work that wasn't terribly challenging and exciting and didn't offer you opportunities to grow and expand, and you had the wherewithal, you may get bored and decide that you will leave because your self-fulfillment need is not actually being met. So it's a great little model just to sort of say that we need to make people feel that they belong first, that they are important, and that once they feel they belong and important, they will then be ready to be challenged, which is obviously self-fulfillment. Now, another interesting model was McGregor. Now, McGregor's model is pretty much called just a theory X and theory Y, and he argues that the attitude that a manager has, or their assumptions about human nature, have a huge bearing on the level of motivation in their team. So, and what he's done here, as you can see on your screen, theory X managers are managers that believe that people fundamentally dislike work and they'll get out of it if they're given the opportunity, that work is a necessary survival need, people will avoid it, people are lazy fundamentally, they prefer direction, they want strong direction rather than to think for themselves, they're often unambitious and so forth. Now, if you've ever had a manager that's a theory X manager, you would well and truly know that, and you would probably not appreciate it either. That I've had a theory X manager in my career. It's not very pleasant because those people constantly underestimate you because of their basic assumptions about human nature. And then, of course, the theory Y manager is the exact opposite. These are people who believe that employees see work as natural, people who direct themselves given the opportunity, people who will accept responsibility if it's given in the right way, and that they can be quite creative and imaginative at the time. So you can see that there is two distinctions there, and the argument is, of course, if you're a theory Y manager, that you've got a much better opportunity to be able to create the motivational environment for people to give it their best. So have a think about where you sit on the model. Are you a theory X manager or a theory Y manager? You may well be in between the two. But there are plenty of Theory X managers out there, I can assure you. But it's about their assumptions of human nature. Now, the carrot and the stick is something that's been around for a long time, using rewards and punishment in the workplace as a way of, I guess, motivating people. Daniel Pink, in his great book Drive, indicated that the carrot and the stick was very, very good for semi-skilled and unskilled workers. So people who might be working in a production environment, who are doing very mundane, boring work, repetitive work, the carrot and the stick works really well. But of course, you're not working in that sort of environment, and a lot of the people, or all the people that you work with, are reasonably well educated, have got a fair skill set, and in these environments, Daniel Pink would argue that the carrot and the stick is not as effective as we'd like to think. In fact, he even argues in his book that it can actually be detrimental to creating the motivational environment we need, which is interesting, isn't it? So what's he saying? Daniel Pink is saying, and this I think is the crux of the whole program today, that he says that knowledge workers, people that work with you and yourself, knowledge workers need three things ultimately from you. They need to feel a sense of purpose. So they need to feel that their work is meaningful and it makes a difference. And so that's that line of sight, remember, between what they do and what they're trying to achieve. Pink says that they also need to feel a sense of autonomy. In other words, they need to feel some sense of freedom about how they do their work and basically how they might structure what they do. And you saw in the survey before that the need to think for themselves was number 2 on the list of what people wanted in their work. And the third thing that Pink says that people want is mastery. That is, they want to feel as if they're growing and developing. And again, you saw evidence of that earlier. So really, if you wanted to distill this all down into some simple concepts that you could use immediately after this webinar, provide people with a sense of why. So in other words, explain to people the implications and the purpose of the work that they do, project by project, report by report, situation by situation. Spend a bit of time explaining that. Give people some freedom and options to decide how they go about dealing with their work. And also, of course, make sure you back them in terms of skill development and personal development. And the argument is, if you can do those three things and you do them consistently and persistently with everybody, it's likely that you're creating that environment that's going to be motivational to most knowledge workers. So what I want to do now, just coming towards the end, if you've got any questions, you want to, I've covered a lot of things this morning, but if you've got anything you would like to ask, go for your life. I'm more than happy to accept the questions. Just go to the question box and type it in. While you might be thinking about that, let me try and summarize everything that I've talked about today. So what are some practical takeaways from this webinar? What are some things that might help you? And let's see how we go with that. I think I've just got a question here. Okay, no. I think someone might have started writing and they've stopped. But anyway, look, let's go. Whoop, there it is now. Let's see what we've got. No? All right. Okay, let me go through this. So let's start up here. It's important that people have some clarity around what their tasks are. So really it's about the certainty of how things are done. People need to feel that sense of security, right? Remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? They need to feel a sense of security. And that comes from knowing what they need to do and how they need to do it and how well they're doing it, which is that feedback. Going across the page, people need and want frequent positive feedback. They want all sorts of feedback. So keep doing that, because you can see that that's a really important tenet in the whole check-in at Treasury program. Show people how they can contribute. This is the line of sight between what they do and the end result. let people know the significance of the work that they're doing. Now, you can do this in two ways. You can talk about the benefits, or you can talk about the drawbacks of not doing it right. Either way, the person should be under no doubt about the implications of the task they're doing and how it impacts other things inside and outside Treasury. Going down the page, starting on the left-hand side, encourage personal goal clarification. This is what Daniel Pink talks about as autonomy. Give people a chance and freedom to work out what they need to do in order to fulfill their job role. Match their job with personal motives. So try and link a person's motivation with the work that they do wherever possible. Give people a sense of variety in their work if possible. Make apparent the personal gains for personal and team productivity. People, again, need to see a line of sight between what they're doing and the end result. Recognise individual efforts. You might recall that on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top of the apex, just before self-actualization, was prestige. So people need to feel that their contribution is being recognised. And of course, it was high on the list of what people wanted in their job too. Remove organisational blocks. Now, I'm sure in Treasury there are many organisational blocks, and some of those blocks can't be removed. Maybe you can move around the blocks, if you can't remove them. But wherever possible, I think your job is to pave the way. A typical organisational block might be that another team is very slow in getting their information to your team. So perhaps you could go and talk to the manager in that team and start to find a way where you can accelerate the urgency of that information. That's an organisational block. But don't forget also, the last one there is that you personally probably have some blocks as well in terms of your own style of leadership. And hopefully you're looking at yourself and thinking about how you can improve on those things. So there's 9 very practical things that you can do immediately that will make a difference to elevate that environment where people may choose to be motivated. Okay, so homework. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to exercise Daniel Pink's model of autonomy, mastery and purpose. I'd like you to go out and just think about this concept of autonomy, mastery and purpose. If you want a good book to read, you can't go past Drive by Daniel Pink. And then I want you to start looking at your people a little closer. Perhaps even start a conversation in your check-ins around the drivers, the motivational drivers of team members. I think that's really important and useful for you in terms of knowing how other people tick, because doing the full circle, your job ultimately is to get the best from the people that you lead. And that's pretty much the note I want to finish on. So folks, if there are no questions, and it doesn't look as if there are, I'll leave it at that. And I wish you well, and enjoy your check-ins. I hope you've got some good things that are happening there, and I'll obviously be seeing you at some stage soon, and I'll be really keen to hear all your war stories. So thanks everyone, all the very best, and we'll catch up again shortly. Thank you and goodbye.